We have Alex Weston from Mayo Clinic. He's a senior data scientist analyst in the Digital Innovation Lab at the Mayo Clinic. He received his PhD in biomedical engineering from the Mayo Clinic Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences, and his background includes medical imaging, machine learning model development, and his research interests include building practical deep learning-based models which can quantify novel predictors of health from medical imaging and signals of data. Alex, can you hear us okay?
Yes, can you hear me?
Perfect, I can hear you. Over to you. Feel free to share your screen and walk through your slides, and we'll have some time at the end for questions.
Perfect. Okay. If I can full screen here. Can you see this okay?
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay, so I'll be presenting on some work we've done using a machine learning analysis of these volatile profiles to detect non-invasive biomarkers of liver disease. So first, a little bit of background, clinical background on the condition that we're studying. So we're looking specifically at advanced liver disease in the form of cirrhosis. And so liver cirrhosis is when the liver is damaged from fibrosis or from other scarring. And there's three etiologies or three main causes that we categorize for cirrhosis. So the first is infection, for example, hepatitis B or C. The second is toxicity, the most common of which is a history of alcohol use. And then there's this other category that includes often genetic factors or genetic diseases such as primary biliary cholangitis or NASH. So for purposes of our study, cirrhosis progresses from compensated disease to decompensated disease. So compensated means that the liver is able to maintain its function of filtering out toxins and other metabolites from the body. So this is stage 1 or stage 2 disease, but eventually if cirrhosis is advanced enough, it'll progress to decompensated disease, which is where the liver is not able to keep up with metabolizing these compounds. And that's when you start to see symptoms such as jaundice or hepatic encephalopathy due to ammonia buildup. And this is a clinical emergency. And so one thing I want to mention, so cirrhosis is a chronic condition. So often patients will persist in compensated disease until they get some stress such as infection or some other cause which will push them into decompensated disease, which now is an emergency. So cirrhosis is usually detected in the clinic with physical symptoms such as tenderness in the abdomen or signs of varices. And is evaluated with several clinical tests. So blood tests to measure the underlying liver function, for example, measuring albumin or platelet levels or certain liver enzymes. Imaging is commonly used, so both CT or MRI to determine the extent of fibrosis. But the gold standard is liver biopsy and subsequent pathology, which is, as you can imagine, a risky procedure. And so because cirrhosis is a chronic condition, it requires frequent monitoring, often yearly checkups, or potentially even more frequently. And so these patients are having these tests done year after year at significant cost and sometimes danger to the patient. So if we had a non-invasive test that could detect and stage cirrhosis, this would have a tremendous impact both in the accessibility of healthcare and in improving patient outcomes. So as many of the talks that we've seen over the last 2 days, cirrhosis is known to be associated with changes in metabolites in the bloodstream that are excreted through the breath. And actually, potentially the link with liver disease is even stronger than with other conditions. Cirrhosis has long been known to be associated with what clinicians call fetor hepaticus. It's a notable change in the odor of a patient's breath. It's described as being musty. And this has been described for hundreds of years. And so more recently in the literature, several of these VOCs, particularly limonene, has been linked with cirrhosis and fibrosis. So the objective of our study is to establish a data-driven approach from these spectrogram signals to diagnose liver cirrhosis from VOCs using machine learning or deep learning, which hopefully will allow us to parse out a more complex signature of the metabolites in a patient's breath. So a brief overview of the methods. I've broken this talk down into 3 parts. So the first is just describing our sample collection and processing. Next, I'm going to be talking about our first paper, which is a machine learning analysis of these volatile profiles. And then lastly, I'll be describing an experiment we did with a deep learning model. So first, some backgrounds on our subject enrollment. So this was IRB approved prospective study where we enrolled 46 individuals. 35 had some stage of liver cirrhosis, and 11 of which were our healthy controls. And so the characteristics between cirrhosis patients and healthy controls is shown in this table. One thing I want to highlight, the only significant or the only substantial difference between these 2 populations was age. Cirrhosis patients tend to be a bit older versus our healthy controls. We were recruiting mostly coworkers and volunteers in the clinic who tended to be a bit younger. So in terms of our cirrhosis patients, we had 13 that were cirrhosis stage 1 compensated, 12 that were stage 2 compensated, and 10 that were stage 3 decompensated, and none that were stage 4. And so the clinical or the symptoms or characteristics of these are shown for these 3 groups. And as you would imagine, there were more symptoms and higher MELD and FIB scores with stage 3 cirrhosis. So a few details of our sample collection. And at this point, I want to acknowledge Matthew Ledenko, who did a tremendous job. He's our lab guru who did all of the data collection for this. And so so these patients generated 1 liter of breath samples, which we separated into 4 independent technical replicates, and each of those replicates was analyzed independently. So all patients fasted 4 hours prior to collection. One thing I want to mention, a small handful of these samples were excluded because they were stored longer than 6 weeks, which we're not entirely sure of the impact that'll have on these metabolites. So most of these you'll see have 4 samples, but if you're paying close attention to our numbers, some of these patients have 3 samples. So I think our data collection, as far as I understand from the other talks, is fairly standard. So we collected samples in the Reciva breath sampler and separated them into technical replicates and used this TD-GC FIMES technique to analyze them. And so this is how we derived our spectrograms. So these molecular features were acquired at several different voltage settings. And then finally, I received the data in the spectrogram format, and we trained our machine learning and deep learning models. And we also acquired environmental or room air blanks that we used to normalize the signal. So this is just a flow chart of our sample collection protocol. One thing that I want to mention that I think might be a little bit unique to our study is our use of these molecular features. So from the spectrogram signal, we defined a molecular feature as any peak that exceeded a certain threshold. And it's a little bit of semantics here, but we're defining these as molecular features, not necessarily as VOCs. And the reason we're drawing that distinction, as many of you are aware, sometimes you can have multiple VOCs that overlap at a same spectrogram point, or potentially as these VOCs are metabolized and begin to break apart, they can result in multiple peaks in our signal. And so we're defining, what we're studying here is these molecular features from our spectrogram, which may not have a one-to-one correspondence with the VOCs. And finally, this is our data pre-processing workflow. Actually, I'll jump ahead to, I always like to have an example of what the data actually looks like. As a data scientist, it helps me understand it a little bit better. And so this is a heat map on the left of what the spectrogram signal looks like. And so the magnitude of each of these peaks is shown with the lighter colors. And then we downsampled this by taking the maximum value for each row into essentially a line plot. So next, I'll talk a little bit about our first experiment, which is using a machine learning algorithm to try to predict cirrhosis versus our healthy controls. So the model for this was trained on spectrograms from 24 patients, and we had a fairly sizable test cohort of 22 patients. And actually, we used these same 22 patients for both our machine learning and deep learning experiments. And so all of the results that I'm showing today are on our test sample, which was not seen during training or validation of the model. And so our first experiment was determining if we could predict cirrhosis from individual peaks from individual molecular features. The second is combining several of these molecular features together into a single score using a logistic regression algorithm. And then finally, we improved on this logistic regression with the use of a machine learning classifier. So this is showing the results of our first experiment. So this is prediction of cirrhosis from individual peaks, so from individual molecular features. And so I also want to mention, so this was Jonathan Thomas was a statistical programmer in our group that did the bulk of the modeling on this. And so I want to be sure to credit him. And he's first author on this paper. But we essentially took the top 8 peaks that had the largest difference between our cirrhosis patients and our healthy controls. And we used these to try to predict on our test data set whether or not someone was cirrhotic or a healthy control. And so the maximum or the fold intensity difference between our cirrhosis patients and our healthy controls is shown in the plot on the left. And one thing I want to highlight from this plot, you can see that the fold change ranged from just over 1 all the way up to 8. And it tended to increase with increasing cirrhosis stage. So we see a larger increase in stage 3 for all of these molecular features compared to stages 2 and 1. And then finally, the AUC values or area under the receiver operating characteristic value for each of these peaks individually is shown on the graph on the right. And so these ROC values range from 0.7 to 0.9. So we got fairly good performance just from these individual peaks alone. So the second experiment was to combine these 8 peaks using logistic regression into a single score. And results on the test data set are shown here. So panel A is the overall ROC curve. And panel B, it's broken out by cirrhosis stage. So we're defining stage 0 in red as our healthy controls, and then stages 1, 2, and 3. So that we achieved a AUC value of this combined score of 0.785, about 0.79, with a sensitivity of 90% and a specificity of 57%. And again, we see that this molecular feature score, or the magnitude, tends to increase with increasing cirrhosis stage, which is shown in panel C. And the molecular feature score is also higher with MELD, the model for end-stage liver disease score, and FIB4 score, which are 2 metrics for evaluating cirrhosis in the clinic. And so that's exactly what we would expect. So the next experiment was, so we used these 8 peaks using a logistic regression classifier, and then we used those same 8 peaks using a machine learning classifier. And so the results of several of our top machine learning models are shown in this graph. And so as many of you know, there's a whole library of different machine learning algorithms that often all do a great job that are all available for us to use. And so the results of the top 3 are shown here. The one that we happened to find was the best was this random undersampled boosted tree model, which is shown in the far right plot. And so this model achieved an AUC value of 0.84. With sensitivity and specificity values are shown. And so the biggest impact or the biggest improvement that we saw with our machine learning classifier versus logistic regression was in the specificity, which jumped from 0.57 to 0.75. And we also show in panel B the effects of normalizing with room air samples. So when we normalized out room air, we saw slightly better performance, although the difference was small. And then panel C shows a machine learning classifier trained to differentiate cirrhosis stage. So within our cirrhosis patients, one that differentiated stage 3 from stage 1, I believe. So the final machine learning experiment. So we combined our classifier for cirrhosis versus no cirrhosis with a second one to differentiate between compensated stage 1 and 2 versus decompensated stage 3. So we're calling these 2 models our tandem classifier. And so the results of this classifier are shown in a pairwise comparison, differentiating firstly, stage 1, 2, and 3 versus our healthy controls, and then separating that out by stage. And so I know there's a lot of numbers here. The one that I want to highlight is our best performance came from separating out stage 3 cirrhosis patients from our healthy controls, which is this graph here, which is exactly what you would expect. This is where there's the most obvious difference in advanced disease versus our healthy controls. So some takeaway points here. We demonstrated proof of concept of using a machine learning approach for detecting cirrhosis from breath samples. So prediction of cirrhosis using the individual molecular features was effective with an average AUC of 0.75. But it improved when we included 8 of the top molecular features into a single score using logistic regression. AUC went from 0.75 to 0.79. And we saw further improvement when we used a machine learning model instead of logistic regression with a top AUC of 0.84. And so one of the things that this suggests to us is that the more molecular features or the larger amount of volatilomic data that you can apply to the classifier, the better your performance. So rather than taking individual peaks, the best performance was when we included all of the peaks that we know are important into a single classifier. So that leads us to our second aim, which is using a deep learning model for this approach. And so a natural question is, why would we want to use deep learning when we have good performance using a simpler machine learning classifier? So deep neural networks, we know, have the capacity to encode very complex nonlinear relationships. In particular, in signals processing, a flavor of deep learning algorithm called convolutional neural network does extremely well. It often outperforms not only other machine learning algorithms, but other deep learning algorithms. And so in my background in medical imaging, these convolutional neural networks are the go-to algorithm that we use over and over again with excellent results. And so one of the things that, one of the goals or one of the aims with this deep learning algorithm is that we can incorporate not only these individual molecular features, but the entire volatilomic signal. And the algorithm, in theory, should be able to learn the nonlinear relationships between all of the peaks in our signal. So rather than doing this pre-processing step where we extract the peaks, we just feed our raw signal into the deep learning algorithm, and that's what achieves our prediction. And so one note, again, we experimented with a number of different neural network settings. The one that we saw the best over and over again was the CNN model. And so for simplicity, this is the one I'm talking about today. So again, we trained our model on 24 patients and evaluated them on a test data set of 22 patients that were not seen during the training and validation sets. And actually one note, so we used the exact same test split for this experiment as to our previous one. And so our results should be directly comparable. So I'll talk about the results of our convolutional neural network. And then finally, I'll go into an explainable AI technique called SHAP, or Shapley Additive Explanations, that we use to try to identify which molecular features or which VOC indices are important for cirrhosis prediction. And I want to credit Miko, who's a statistical programmer in our group, who did the bulk of the work in modeling this. So this is our obligatory diagram of what the convolutional neural network architecture was. So this is our flow chart of the model. And so just one thing I'll mention from this, we ended up training a custom CNN architecture. We used a number of different pre-trained models. We saw best performance with a CNN, and I think this is just because the dimensionality of our data is pretty unique. You know, a lot of these off-the-shelf models are trained on images, and so they're expecting you know, a matrix dimension of 256 by 256, which doesn't really fit the signal that we're using for these spectrograms. And so that's why I think we ended up having best performance with a custom architecture. So a little bit on our sample pre-processing. So we used k-fold cross-validation for this study. So again, we set aside our test cohorts of 22 patients, which were not seen during training. So this left us with 82 samples from 24 patients, which is a little bit small in terms of training a deep learning algorithm. And so that's why we use this k-fold cross-validation technique. So essentially, we split this training data set into 4 different groups, or 4 splits, and then trained 4 independent CNN models. For example, we trained a model on folds 2, 3, and 4 and validated it on fold 1, and so on and so forth. And so everything was kept the same between these models, except for the split of data that we saw. And then as a final step, we combined all 4 of these models into an ensemble by taking the average prediction value and evaluated that along with our constituent models on the test data set. So here is the ROC curves associated with predicting cirrhosis versus our healthy controls. And so the 4 gray lines here are our 4 constituent models from our best performing architecture. And then the average or ensemble is shown in the blue line here. So the AUCs of the individual models ranged from 0.68 up to 0.89. And the ensemble model achieved an AUC value of 0.9. And so what we see is that combining these models into an ensemble slightly improved the performance, but greatly improved the consistency of the deep learning classifier. And I'll show a few examples of that on a later slide. So next I'll show the confusion matrix, aptly named, but this shows the performance of our model on the patient level and the sample level predictions. And so along the y-axis here at the bottom, you see the actual classification of whether or not the patient had cirrhosis or not. And then our prediction is shown on the y-axis here. And so what we're seeing is that the model correctly identified 17 patients that had cirrhosis and 2 of our healthy controls, and then 3 false positive predictions where the model is falsely classifying a healthy patient as one that's having disease. And so the overall performance of this model, we had 100% sensitivity, in other words, perfect detection of cirrhosis. 40% specificity with an overall F1 score of 92%. And so you'll probably notice that our model is displaying a tendency towards over-detecting cirrhosis. So it's a tendency to call healthy patients cirrhotic. And we believe that that's driven largely by some imbalance in our data set. We had a lot more of our disease patients than our healthy controls, which is something we can rectify in future studies. So I know this slide gets a little bit messy. I always like to show an example of what our model is actually predicting, because I think it helps wrap your head around how this potentially could be used in the clinic. And so I'm showing two examples from our test data set here. So the one on the left is a true positive sample, and the one on the right is a false positive sample. And so you can see our spectrogram signal obviously is this blue line plot here. And then it's a little bit small, but at the top I'm printing out the results of our constituent models. And so the one on the left, we have 4 models right from our 4 cross-validation splits, or our 4 k-fold splits. And each one is predicting, positive is predicting cirrhosis with a score of 1 or 100%. So another way to interpret this is that the model is 100% confident that this patient has cirrhosis. And so when we combine those 4 measures into our ensemble, obviously we get an ensemble score of 100% positive. So this is from a stage 3 cirrhosis patient too, I should mention. Versus the one on the right is a false positive prediction. So we have 3 of our models that are predicting positive, and 1 that is predicting that this patient is healthy. So there's some dissent, right, in our model predictions. And this patient is actually healthy. And so then when we combine those, the ensemble level performance, that ensemble score is 75%. So I think I've mentioned all of this already, but this is just the overall AUC and sensitivity and specificity scores for our constituent models, along with our overall ensemble at the sample level and at the patient level. One other thing we saw from this data set, so despite some of the imbalance, the model confidence improved, particularly with late stage cirrhosis patients. So this is the bar plot that I'm showing here, or the box and whisker plot that I'm showing. And so this is the actual model output scores separated out by cirrhosis stage. So our healthy patients on the far left, and stage 1, 2, and 3 cirrhosis. And so what we're seeing is that our model is increasing in confidence with our cirrhosis stage 3 patients versus stage 2 and 1. And in fact, all of the mistakes that we're seeing in our model are from differentiating healthy controls from cirrhosis stage 1 patients, which is our lowest stage of disease. And often these stage 1 patients are functionally asymptomatic. So it's often very difficult to tell even that they have cirrhosis. So our takeaways from this, so our optimal performance was seen with an ensemble model, which achieved an overall AUC of 90%. We had a trend towards higher sensitivity for our model. And mistakes came from differentiating healthy and stage 1 cirrhosis patients, suggesting that the model is correctly identifying hallmarks of more severe disease with a high accuracy. Okay, so next I want to talk a little bit about this experiment we ran with an explainable AI technique called SHAP. So SHAP stands for Shapley Additive Explanations. And so one comment on explainable AI. So within the deep learning space, for a very long time, there were no explainable AI techniques, or very few explainable AI techniques, I should say. So a lot of these deep learning algorithms functions more or less as black box classifiers, and it was very hard to tell what the model was actually seeing or what was contributing to the prediction. So this is particularly a problem, obviously, in a clinical space where we need to know some of the decision-making that's going into these AI predictions. And so this has been a field of rapid growth and rapid interest within the AI community. And SHAP is one of the algorithms that came out of that. So this is an add-on algorithm, so it's separate from our deep neural network. It's an additional algorithm that we run against our neural net, which calculates the contribution of each of our individual features to the prediction. And so it's identifying which features of our original signal are contributing to the final classification. And so the way that we use this SHAP technique is we identified the top 10 features from each of our constituent CNN models from our different K-folds and evaluated the reproducibility of these features between the models. So the models are the same. The data splits, the data is drawn from the same distribution, but the splits are slightly different. And so hopefully what we're seeing is that the model is using the same features in its final prediction. So this is an example of what one of these SHAP plots looks like. And I apologize, there's a lot of information on this slide, but I think it's illustrative. So I tried to cobble this together as best I could. So again, we see an example of our model prediction on the left with our spectrogram signal. And what SHAP gives us is essentially an importance score for every single feature in our signal. So for each of our 3,400 indices here, we're getting an individual set of SHAP scores. And again, we have 4 SHAP panels here for each of our 4 K-fold cross-validated models. And so the way that we interpret these SHAP plots is that the value or the magnitude of each of these measurements is the importance of that feature in determining the final model prediction. And the color indicates whether it's contributing to a positive prediction or a negative prediction. So this model is trained in the context of predicting cirrhosis. And so red features contribute to a diagnosis of cirrhosis, and blue features contributes to a diagnosis of healthy. And so these features essentially are cumulative. So, in any given signal, you'll have some features that contribute to cirrhosis, some features that contribute to healthy, and all of those features combine together into our final output score. And then each of these dots corresponds to one of our samples. And so what we're looking for here is concordance across these 4 constituent models. So one thing you can see, obviously each of these models is looking at a slightly different set of features. And so these SHAP plots, look a little bit messy because they're not all the models are looking at the same features, but if you look closely enough, you start to see patterns or trends emerge. So for example, it looks like all 4 of these models are identifying the same peak about a third of the way down, which is a reproducible signal. And there's a few other of these reproducible peaks as well. And so the way that we use this, so for each of our models, we identified the top 10 peaks by magnitude and looked for the correlation coefficients, or the correlation between these across the constituent models. And so one thing I want to mention, we ran this against the training and validation data set as well as the test data set. And so we want to see correlation across our different models, but also between our training data sets and our test data sets, which indicates it's seeing the same features in training as well as testing. So these are our heat maps that show which VOCs are being identified, or which metabolic features, I should say, are being identified. And so the intensity, or I guess color of each of these plots indicates the number of models that are identifying that compound. And so the darker red means that 3 or 4 of our constituent models are identifying the compound. Lighter red means 1 or 2 are. And these are just 4 different examples from our test data set. And so, a couple of things I want to mention based off these plots. So firstly, these SHAP plots do identify real peaks in our signal, which is good from a validation standpoint, right? This is what we're hoping to see. And then a lot of these models are identifying the same peaks. And I guess one thing I want to mention, so it's not necessarily the magnitude of spectrogram feature that's important, right? Some of these peaks are very large, but also some of these that are being picked up are very small. And so hopefully what this means is our deep neural network is identifying constituent molecular features, regardless of their magnitude, that are consistently contributing to a prediction. So hopefully we're gleaning more information out of these spectrograms than just identifying the largest peaks. So this is our summary of our reproducibility analysis. So by identifying the top 10 features from our 4 models, this identified 22 unique molecular features or unique compounds. So 14 of these, or 64%, were seen, quote unquote, by 2 or more models. 2 compounds were seen by 3 models, and 1 compound was seen by all 4 models. And so what this suggests to us is the SHAP analysis is that the model performance is based on reproducible features. And there's moderate collinearity between these features. And hopefully this gives us the next step, which is identifying the identity of these molecular features or these VOCs for subsequent characterization. So in conclusion, we demonstrate the feasibility of an AI approach to diagnosing liver cirrhosis from molecular features analyzed using this breath biopsy technique. We achieved best performance with an ensemble CNN model, which is consistent with the use of CNNs for medical imaging and signals processing in the literature. And finally, our SHAP analysis revealed a reproducible set of molecular features that are associated with prediction, which support the viability of our approach and demonstrate that cirrhosis is associated with a change in many compounds within this metabolic profile, and hopefully provides a target for future biomarker characterization. So I want to acknowledge our team. So Dr. Patel, who's PI on the study, as well as Matthew and Miko, and Jonathan. Unfortunately, so Jonathan took actually went on to medical school at University of Central Florida, and no longer has a LinkedIn profile. So unfortunately, I was not able to find a picture of him as hard as I could try, but want to acknowledge his work as well. So yeah, with that, happy to take any questions. One thing I want to mention, so we're very interested in collaborating on this, particularly regarding our deep learning analytical tools. So if that's something you're interested in, please reach out. And I realize I'm a little bit under time, so that means we have plenty of time for questions.
That's great. Thank you so much, Alex, for the talk. As you say, we've got a good amount of time for questions. I thought I might kick it off myself with one. In the initial models, trying to understand a little bit more what the molecular feature actually was. So you have retention time, and then when you do Bayes analysis, you have a sweep of the compensation voltage. Do you also increment the dispersion field as well? Or is it retention time and compensation voltage just defined in the array? And then you have each individual pixel. Is that essentially a molecular feature there? Yeah, so on the heat map, so is a molecular feature essentially a pixel in that overall heat map?
Correct. Yes, it's a pixel index. So it's a row in our heat map here.
Got it.
Yeah, so in terms of the dispersion field question, so it's a great question. So Matthew did the collection and analysis for this. So he's the technical expert. I believe he ran this at 3 different dispersion field settings. And I believe, so I think I have it in a supplemental slide. I think he saw the best or the largest magnitude difference in these molecular features at the 65 voltage setting. So I believe we only analyzed samples from the 65 voltage dispersion field setting, but I would have to double check on that.
Got it. That makes sense. I wasn't sure if you were doing a sweep within the analysis as opposed to doing what you've outlined here of having separate set points and then picking the best set point. So there's obviously a lot of molecular features there. So when you're doing the univariate analysis, if you're looking at corrected p-values, having a lot of features there is going to penalize when you look at corrected p-values there. I was wondering if you could comment just in terms of the amount of features compared to the amount of samples that you have to analyze.
Yeah, so that's a big concern, particularly with these deep learning models. They are particularly prone to overfitting, as you know. So unfortunately, let me jump to this slide at the end. Yeah, so unfortunately, so when we train these deep learning models, we don't have the equivalent of a p-value that would allow us to establish statistical significance for these features, which is a little bit of a limitation of the deep learning approach. And so that's why we did this additional SHAP analysis. That's why the SHAP analysis is so important. And so we really want to show that, despite the fact that there are a lot of features here that could be contributing to our signal, we really want to show that there are a few or a small handful of these features that are consistently being used for prediction. And that's what I think that we see here with these heat maps. It's very dispersed, right? There's a lot of features that are potentially contributing to the prediction, but there's 3 or 4 here that are seen over and over again by these models.
Got it. There's a question in from Rick Yost. This is a good slide to be on. I think you kind of answered it actually with the previous heat map question. So here, Rick's asking, is the plot just a chromatogram? If so, do you get any advantage with the FAMES compared to using just a standard detector like an FID? But I think what you'd said before is this is the plot of the chromatogram, but you are doing a FAMES sweep as well to get orthogonal information. Is that right? So under each kind of line here, you have a compensation voltage sweep, and this is just the integrated CV sweep.
I believe so. So let me go back to this signal plot. I'm feeling a little bit out of my depth here, but I'll attempt to answer. And the details of this, so I'll link to the paper too. So all of the details of our sample collection are in the paper. So if I don't answer good enough, you can refer to that as well. So I think part of the confusion is, so we downsampled this. So just from a data analysis step, we downsampled this chromatogram or heat map into a single column, basically to reduce the dimensionality of the data. And so I believe that this dispersion sweep that you're talking about is incorporated in this signal, and potentially we're downsampling this just to a line plot.
Yeah. So summing across the compensation voltage is probably the case.
Yeah.
There's a couple of questions related to the identity of the features. I think you had mentioned that was part of future work. So it's, do you know the identity of these molecular features, both in univariate analysis, and I think you had also mentioned that there was a single compound that was seen or selected in all 4 models. Yeah,
so that's probably is the biggest issue, or I would say is a limitation of the study. We don't know necessarily what these what the identity of these molecular features are. That's going to be the subject of future work. And I'll have to defer on, so Dr. Patel is the PI on this study, and he understands, some of the technical and clinical side of this better than I do. But I know that's definitely something, obviously, that we're interested in pursuing.
Got it. One of the follow-up comments that Rick has made actually is, from that, using the same column, you could potentially connect to a mass spec to get definitive identification of some of those VOCs. One other question relates more to the clinical positioning. So this is focused around cirrhosis. Is this more about proof of concept, proof of principle, or is there clinical need or positioning for such a test for cirrhosis in clinical practice? Or is this something that would, ideally be translated back to earlier stages such as NAFLD and NASH?
Yeah, that's a great question. So firstly, I would characterize this as preliminary or a pilot study on a limited number of patients. And so the next step, for example, for a study like this would to do a prospective study. There is a real clinical need here. Let me go back to my clinical slide. So I see two major clinical needs here. So the first is in early detection. Right? A lot of these patients live with cirrhosis and are not aware of it for many, many years. And cirrhosis, in addition to the liver, the liver disease aspect of this, it contributes to HCC, so liver cancer, and many other conditions as well. So the earlier that we can detect this, the better. And so early diagnosis potentially is a big one. If we could do some sort of screening study. Probably the biggest or most important one in my mind is following up these patients over time. And so, like I mentioned, they have to come back for these expensive and potentially risky procedures year after year. And it really hurts. In a lot of cases, it hurts adherence to the proper clinical protocol. And so if we had a really simple test or something non-invasive that they could do potentially from home, where we could monitor, the ups and downs of their disease, I think that would go a long way towards improving care.
Got it, thanks. Next question is, one of your models reached 40% specificity. Have you tried oversampling or undersampling methods to improve that?
Yes, we did try oversample. We tried a lot of things, actually. Let me jump to that slide. So that's the confusion matrix slide. Yep, we tried oversampling. We tried some augmentation techniques. So if you're not familiar, you add a small amount of randomness to your sample, which doesn't impact the signal at all, but it just disrupts the background to prevent overfitting. So that's another thing that we tried. Ultimately, I think we just need to accrue more healthy control so that we have more examples here that we can train against.
Got it. There's a question here relating to prospective validation. I had a similar question. So in the model that was built off of 24, and then you had 22 in the test set. Has there been any prospective validation work done of completely new patient samples and applied against the model? But we saw in a really good talk yesterday in a ARDS talk, compound that looked reasonable from a biological rationale standpoint. Model looked quite good in the initial discovery and within the initial validation, but when they did prospective validation, the model fell over basically.
Right. Yeah, so that definitely is the next step for this. We need to do prospective validation. Yeah, I saw that talk as well. I thought it was a great talk. It's definitely really important. We don't do enough of these prospective studies in the data science, machine learning space. It's something that I think is getting better. A lot of our studies, we're doing more external validation at other hospitals or on different patient populations. So it's definitely something that we think about. And so it's something we would have to do for this study.
Yeah, that's great. And one other question is, what's the rationale to exclude molecular features below a set level or abundance? How did you choose the particular cutoff?
So I think the cutoff was determined experimentally. Let me go to that slide. Yeah, off the top of my head, I don't know the exact criteria or the exact threshold that we use to identify those peaks. One thing I'll mention, for this machine learning study, we ended up taking the top 8 peaks anyway. So I think regardless of whatever this threshold would have been set to, we would have gotten a similar result just because we're looking at the largest magnitude features. But I would have to defer on the details of that.
Got it. So I think one of the interesting things about this application, there's been quite a lot of work done in and around cirrhosis and liver disease as well. I know you're going to try and identify the compounds, but the one compound seen across all 4 models, I would bet a pint of beer that it's going to be limonene, if I had to pick something. Okay.
Yeah, I think I just to comment on that, I think you're right. So Dr. Patel knows a lot more about this than I do. And when we were going through these graphs, like the first thing he said is, yeah, that's probably limonene.
Yeah, and even if you don't know for sure, I think if you were to inject limonene into the instrument and see if that's coming out at the same region in the chromatogram, so with the model being able to highlight, you know, where the features of interest are, that may be a quick way to eyeball the chromatogram to see whether or not it is likely to be limonene before, you know, doing more detailed confirmation studies. Okay, here I suppose this is kind of broader point about AI models. You know, what is the advantage of using these AI approaches compared with your more classical, you know, univariate, identify a few compounds, understand the biology, maybe combine into a multivariate model? And related to that is, how can you then be sure the models are picking out true features that relate to the disease?
Yeah, so the biggest advantage that we see, especially of the deep learning approach, is the ability to incorporate that entire signal into our prediction. So the large peaks such as limonene, but then also potentially, you know, as these volatile organic compounds begin to break down, you know, we could get a signature of smaller peaks that maybe associate with those specific VOCs. So that's, I think, the advantage of using a deep learning approach, is you can incorporate that entire signal. And then in terms of, you know, making sure that we're actually seeing real peaks, again, for us, this comes back to the SHAP analysis. Well, 2 things. So the SHAP analysis to identify which peaks are being seen. Yeah, and potentially we could even do an additional step of, you know, identifying those peaks from the SHAP and training a separate logistic model on those. That would sort of be like an exploratory study in my mind, which would further help validate this. And then finally, the last thing I'll say is just making sure that we do a good job with our prospective validation. So we, you know, made sure that our test data set was totally separate from our training validation. And then, you know, evaluating it on a new data set that's from a different distribution to make sure that, you know, the model performs equally well.
Yeah, fantastic. I think the SHAP analysis is very powerful as well. We've seen some work reported in IMABuilding and FAMES before, where it's, you know, the classifier is being driven by a region of the spectra where, you know, there can't be a true peak present there as well. Sure. So anything that kind of highlights that region is driving the model, you can then sense check it against, you know, what you know is actually happening with the instrumentation, the reality of the instrumentation. Well, thanks again so much for the talk today, Alex. It was fascinating, and, you know, we'll be very interested to see, you know, the follow-up work in those prospective studies as well. So thanks again. Have a great rest of your day.